Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 84th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, I'm going to be talking about the language we use to discuss disaster and why it matters with Disasters Deconstructed podcast co-hosts Ksenia Chimutina and Jason von Medding. You can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube Live. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. I'd like to welcome new viewers and listeners who may be checking out COVID Calls this week for the first time. You can also hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. If you're wondering what COVID Calls is all about, be sure to check out our introductory episode on Podbean. It's also linked on the Facebook page. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word. Send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, July 16th, there are 13,589,273 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 13,382,020 cases yesterday. Of those, 3,499,771 are in the United States. That's up from 3,448,625 yesterday. There are now a total of 137,420 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States. That's up from 136,699 yesterday. As a way to bring humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or story of advocacy for COVID-19 sufferers every day, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline: Herbert Wolf Melgar, broadcaster and festival organizer, dies of COVID-19. Author is Luz Lazo, and this was published June 29th in the Washington Post. Herbert Wolf Melgar, 56, a broadcaster who organized major Hispanic festivals in the Washington region and galvanized the Salvadoran diaspora to stay engaged in the future of their home country, died May 9th of complications from COVID-19. Melgar co-hosted the well-known weekly talk show Salvavision, an internet platform he used to discuss political and social affairs in his native El Salvador, reaching thousands of Spanish-speaking homes in the region. He was a creative mind, his colleague and co-host Alvaro Mendez said. Loved music and films. He was most passionate when he was behind the mic. In every show broadcast on Facebook Live, Melgar would begin by acknowledging people listening, responding to questions and comments from followers, and sending birthday wishes. Then he would turn to hours of discussion about politics in El Salvador and the country's millennial president, Nayib Bukele. Melgar began his career as a sound engineer during a tumultuous political time in El Salvador. As a young man, he traveled the country with an entourage of musicians, going from one town carnival to the next, even at the peak of the decade-long civil war in the 1980s. He wanted to bring happiness to the most remote towns of the country during a time when it was super dangerous. They had to travel with large signs identifying themselves as musicians, his younger brother Marvin Melgar recalls. Herbert Melgar worked with such iconic Salvadoran bands, including Orquesta Guan Bamboo, Espiritu Libre, and La Raza Band. In the 1990s, musical events brought him to the Washington area, where he stayed in search of economic opportunity, friends said. He joined one of the largest Salvadoran communities outside El Salvador. He lived in the Washington area for nearly 25 years, most recently in Prince George's County, Mendez said. Melgar also founded Imperio Radio, another passion project that he tended to around his Salvavision gig and his full-time job designing advertising spots for local Latino businesses. Along with Mendez, he promoted musical and cultural events within the largely Salvadoran community of Washington and helped organize Latino festivals, including the festival Guanaco every fall in Hyattsville. His connections with the music scene in El Salvador were instrumental in facilitating the visits of popular Salvadoran bands to the area, Mendez said. On the talk show, Melgar was a strong critic of Bukele, most recently blasting him for enforcing a strict quarantine during the COVID-19 pandemic, which Melgar said had left many poor Salvadorans stuck at home without food. That guy has never picked a shovel, he said in a recent broadcast. He only knows to give orders. In his last few shows, Melgar, along with Mendez, used the Salva Vision platform to discuss the disproportionate impact the coronavirus pandemic was having on immigrant workers in the Washington region, and to urge listeners to stay home during the pandemic. The videos reached as many as 70,000 people in the Washington region and beyond, Mendez said. The only place where we can be now is where the family is, Melgar said on the air in April, before he fell ill with the coronavirus. If you're in quarantine, I hope you're having a good time. If you're quarantining with your family, well, enjoy your children and other relatives. He had planned to return to El Salvador. His brother Marvin Melgar said his wife and 2 adult children live there. All right, I'd like to turn to my discussion now, and I'm really excited to have this discussion with my 2 guests today, and let me introduce them. Let me start with Jason. Dr. Jason von Meding is an associate professor at the University of Florida and a founding faculty member of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience. Before moving to the US, he spent 6 years at the University of Newcastle, Australia, where he established the Disaster and Development Research Group and worked with communities in the Asia-Pacific region using participatory methods to study disaster risk. In the past 5 years, he has developed a focus on communicating science to non-academic audiences, writing for blogs, magazines, and newspapers, and creating video content. Also through his podcast that he co-hosts with my second guest, Disasters Deconstructed, the podcast. Our second guest is Dr. Ksenia Chilotina. She's a senior lecturer in sustainable and resilient urbanism at the School of Architecture, Building, and Civil Engineering in Loughborough University in the UK. She's originally from Russia, and before moving to the UK, she lived in China, where she got her master's degree. Her research explores the processes of disaster risk creation and politics of disasters, especially under the pressures of neoliberalism, urbanization, and climate change. Ksenia uses her work to draw attention to the fact that disasters are not natural. I'm sure we'll discuss this today. Ksenia is also co-author of a textbook, Disaster Risk Reduction for the Built Environment, which appeared in 2017 with Wiley, and she's the co-host of Disasters Deconstructed. Jason and Ksenia, thanks for making time to come on COVID Calls today.
Hi, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Good
to see you both.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for making time. I want to remind people that you can get questions in, and I'm sure we will have some today. Just gonna, I'm getting a little feedback on the, there we go. Remind people you can get your questions in today. You can just put them in on YouTube Live in the chat, or you can put them up using Twitter. If you want to, just be sure to tag at US of Disaster. So let me ask a question that I've been asking everyone. I'll start, Ksenia, with you. Where are you calling in from, and what's the COVID-19 situation there?
Well, so I'm calling in from Nottingham in the UK, you know, the city of Robin Hood and Sheriff of Nottingham. That's what we're famous for. So with COVID situations, as of today, we have had 292,552 confirmed cases. And this includes 642 new cases today. And sadly, we have 45,119 people dead, including 66 deaths today. And so in Nottingham, we had 1,193 deaths. But there's been a massive outbreak in Leicester, which is just 20 minutes from Nottingham, kind of by train. So Leicester is now on the second lockdown. Yeah, so we don't know what's going to happen. You know, it's not great. Let's put it that way.
Jason, let me bring the same question to you. Where are you calling in from, and what's the COVID-19 situation there?
Hey, Scott. So, hi from Gainesville, Florida. I mean, the global epicenter, it seems. We're setting new records all the time, and yeah, I guess the U.S. is in some ways the world's Florida, right? And I mean, my feeling is that it's a lot of this is on the so-called leaders in this state, and it's not a wonder that hashtag Death Santis is trending on Twitter. So if anybody hasn't been over there, check out Death Santis. I mean, at this time when the cases are really skyrocketing here, and the experts are recommending shutdown, instead of that, we see hospitals filling up. We see Disney reopening fully, and other theme parks, and generally minimal distancing requirements. So I mean, I know that it's funny and all to kind of laugh at Floridians, but my feeling is that it's a bigger problem than Floridians, right? It's a governance failure. And personally, I've been trying to think about what to do in fall with my kids in school while we're living in Florida, and the kids are at public school. So we've been following the school board decisions, and yesterday they voted to put the start date back by a few weeks, as well as make masks mandatory in the classrooms on the school campus. So we're just trying to figure out what to do, because I mean, at this point, it's a lot of people have been trying to work from home with their kids for many months, and now we are being forced into a position where we need to either continue doing that or just put them back into public school in the middle of at the epicenter of a pandemic. So difficult times here in Florida.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And people may not know, when you said Death Santis, that's a play on words of the governor of Florida, right? Ron DeSantis.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
People may not know. So I want to ask you also about maybe what's been happening with social justice and protests there. Jason, to you, has there been much going on in your community in that regard, in the response to the George Floyd murder?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who moved here 18 months ago, I have talked to people who've been in Gainesville a lot longer, and they said the response in terms of organizing, getting out and protesting has been much stronger and more visible than anything they've seen before here. And as a recent arrival to it's a college town. A lot of the people who are going to the protest are a little bit clueless about organizing. And some of the things that I noticed at the protests here is like, young white people taking selfies and that kind of thing. So that's irritating. But it was really well organized, and I was very impressed with the depth of knowledge and wisdom shown by the organizers here. The really interesting thing for me is like the tension between the relationships that people within the community here, especially in East Gainesville, which is predominantly Black, the close relationships there are within the community and the police in Gainesville. And so the tension there where even the organizers have relationships with the police chief, say, and with officers and their families. And so watching that play out and the nuanced discussions that are happening, I think are really healthy. But it certainly doesn't, the protests don't look like a lot of other cities in the United States.
Ksenia, can I ask that same question of you in terms of what might be happening there where you are at social protest? Has it been very visible?
It has, particularly kind of right in the beginning, because UK has quite a history of slave trade, right, and colonialism, and so Black Lives Matter movement has definitely reacted to what was happening in the US. But as you can imagine here, it was slightly different, and that, the police is different. So all the protests that have happened have been peaceful to an extent. There were a few incidents in London, but even then, it was kind of in single digits. So we had a protest here in Nottingham, and it was all very civilized. If British can do something that's queue and kind of stay away from each other, personal spaces, we finally kind of can use that idea of personal space. And so, yeah, lots of people came, and it was nice and quiet. But the reason it was so well organized in Nottingham is because we have a brilliant MP here. She's her name is Nadia Whittom, and she's a really young Labour MP. So she's really active, and she kind of does lots of stuff in the community, and she does a lot for BME community as well, and works with them very closely. And of course, I think the biggest thing that happened in the UK is that removal of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. That's then started this whole removal of statues that remind people about slave trade and colonialization. And I think that was brilliant to see. I don't think anyone expected to see that.
I thought that was extraordinary, and I think it's something Americans may be tuned into in sort of abstract way, but to really see that we're talking about bringing down statues, not just in the American South, but also in the North in the United States and also in the UK. That's really powerful, because it really shows the sort of global scope of the system that was created.
Yeah. And the symbolism, of that kind of, I guess, of that Bristol statue is that then the activists threw it in the water. For me, that was the strongest, and I kind of maybe hoped that it would remain there, right? Just for everything and everyone that have been thrown in the water. But of course, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. So
Ksenia, let me ask you, I enjoyed reading your bio, and, really enjoyed listening to your podcast. Can you give us a little bit of behind the story? Like, how did you find yourself in the pathway to disaster research?
Thank you, Scott. Well, I was talking about this with Jason today. The practical story is pretty random. As many postdocs go, there is a postdoc opening, and there we go. We all need a job, so we go for it. But intellectually, it was a little bit more logical. So my first degree was in political science and international relations, particularly focusing on Chinese-Russian relations. And that's how I ended up in China. So I then moved to China and lived in China for a couple of years. And so when I studied in Russia, in the school and also through my university degree, climate change wasn't the thing, right? It still really isn't the thing now, and definitely wasn't in the late 90s. And also we had the subject called nature and environment or something like that, and I failed it. So, you're talking to a person who kind of managed to fail nature and environment and geography, in fact, absolutely terrible. And so I never really thought about kind of disasters or climate change or anything like that. But of course, political science kind of gives you a lot of foundation in terms of theory, right, and critical theory. And when I came to China and needed to work on my master's thesis, I got really interested in visual propaganda that Communist Party uses, particularly when it comes to ecology. So everywhere, if you've ever been to China, you see this kind of wonderful communist posters. They're beautiful, and they tell people not to litter, for example, or to respect trees and kind of stuff like that. And I was just so curious about it. And so I wrote master's thesis on that. And I was then offered a PhD here in Nottingham. I didn't know what PhD was. Kind of Russian education system is completely different. And I came here and ended up in a department of civil engineering and kind of an architecture and built environment, which was a little bit unexpected with political science background. And so I then was interested in building regulations. So I was interested in policy. So that podcast you proposed about fire and building regs, I'd listen to that. any day I'd listen to that.
Good.
I love building regulations. And so, but then it kind of all came to me that actually the political science and the building regulations and the policy and the built environment, right, they all sort of come together. And so when that postdoc position happened with Lee Bosher, hey Lee, shout out, Jason knows him really well. It was a position on a project which did something to do with resilience, basically, resilience and security and disasters. And that is when it clicked. And I was like, right, so this is what disasters are, right? So it's not just this kind of natural event that we were told to look out in the geography class. Actually, there's something more to it. And I think the more I thought about it from kind of city point of view, built environment point of view, I started asking myself, so, if we have building regulations, then why do still buildings fail, right? Like, why do still people die? So why are building regs and all the policies are so rubbish? And I guess gradually that's what led me to where I am now and everything that comes with this,
This week with the hazards meeting, it's been an opportunity to read a lot of bios and talk to a lot of people. And I can't think of a field that has more different entry points than disaster research. Thank you for sharing that story. Jason, I want to ask you the same question. What's your entry point into disaster science?
It's interesting. We were discussing this earlier. We had some ideas for a research project to try to investigate this, because it's so true that people have all these entry points. And so for me, from about the age of 10, I wanted to be an architect. And so my secondary school kind of pathway, I got into all the courses I could to further that aim and develop skills for pursuing a career in architecture. And so I went to architecture school in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And it was I went and worked in practice for a year as well. And during my postgraduate studies, I had a chance to do a research thesis. So there was like a sign-up sheet up on the wall, and it said it kind of had a list of professors and what their interests were. And so I was like reading through the thing, and I never really thought about disasters before at all. And I was just in my own little world designing utopias. So I saw the sign-up sheet, and I was very conscious. It was September 2015 or 2005. Sorry, 15. That would make me young. So 2005, Hurricane Katrina aftermath.
Right.
And I saw on the sign-up sheet a professor who's interested in extreme events and the impact of extreme weather on buildings and on structures. Mm. And so I was like, well, as someone born in the United States, I was born in Chicago, but grew up in Ireland. So as someone born over here, that was kind of fresh in my mind, been watching the news. And I thought, oh, I'll go and have a chat with this guy about what he envisages in a research project. And that got me interested, that got me reading, and I decided to work with him, Professor Lukman Oyedele. And we put together a proposal, and it had me out in New Orleans by November 2015. And so that was my first introduction. And I went out there as a designer and I was very focused on like surveying buildings, looking at what happened to different types of buildings and different types of materials and structures when storm surge came in, or when there was high wind, or when there was flooding, right? And so that's kind of what I went out there to do, but I ended up talking to people, which happens if you go anywhere where people have experienced these kinds of things. So I ended up talking to people and introducing interviews into my research in a kind of ad hoc way. And that developed over the time I was there on the Gulf Coast. and in New Orleans. And so I came back and completed another year in architecture school, and my design became my design thesis, 1-year thesis project, became focused on New Orleans. So I went back out there and did kind of flood resilient buildings in New Orleans. And yeah, after that, I continued working in practice a little bit, but got my supervisor encouraged me to apply for a PhD place and funding, and it worked out. And it was 2007, and I had the choice between the research pathway or going back into practice, and I think I made the right decision. So I went with the PhD program, and
right.
My PhD work was initially intended to be design-based, but ended up being more into management, and so it was about project management, and that got me even more into talking with people using qualitative methods. And then and the rest is history. And like I moved from Ireland then to Australia, got more and more involved in working on the social side of disasters. So I was there for 6 years, and then came over to the United States to join the party.
It's really interesting to me too. I want to ask you both. I know you have strong opinions on the term natural disaster, which is going to be our way into our discussion about your approach to science communication. I think it's also particularly relevant that you both have a lot of experience with structures and come from that side of it. And you know, I'm a historian, but I worked for a long time in the history of building codes and the history of technology. And it does, you know, you do come up with, if you come from that direction, you come with a certain understanding of the way that policy and the material world interact, I think. And at the time that I was doing that work and listening to you both talk about your own sort of trajectory, you hadn't been thinking about disasters, and I certainly hadn't been thinking about disasters. But then when you start to actually ask, well, why do things go wrong? You realize all of the things that have to go right with structures, and all of the things that have to go right with all of the codes and policies that go into protection. It's so Byzantine. So, all right, so I want to, well, first I should remind people you're listening to COVID Calls, and you can get your questions in using YouTube live chat. I'm talking with Jason von Medding and Ksenia Chmutina, and having a great discussion. Then we're going to talk now about science communication. So Ksenia, to you first. Natural disaster. Why can't I use it? What's wrong with that? And let's use that as a way to begin talking about disasters and language.
Well, everything is wrong with that, right? Okay, so I guess for me, what the biggest problem with the phrase natural disaster is that people use it without thinking what it actually implies, right? It's the implication of using the term. So when we say that disaster is natural, we de facto blame in nature, be that earthquake or a volcano, right? Or a river kind of that brought flood on the loss and destruction. It is the same with kind of when disasters are called the act of God, right? So the responsibility is put on something or like a deity, right? And so we cannot do anything about it. And because we as humans can't do anything about it, well, why bother? And this is where the problem is. I think the moment we realize that disasters are not natural, we start questioning who is accountable, right? And who creates disasters, and why do we end up with them? Why does a natural process like a flood has to turn to disaster? Does it have to turn to disaster, in fact? And I think, you know, so I've never, I think the only arguments I've ever had about this kind of the semantics of the phrase is actually with academics. It's saying, well, you guys are just kind of picking on words, you know, semantics doesn't matter. We had so many conversations with established academics who keep telling us, well, it's a convenience term, right? Like if you stop saying natural disasters, if you just say disasters, people wouldn't understand what you're saying. But from my experience, every single time somebody asks us, you know, so what it is you're doing, and once we explain why disaster is not natural, people understand within kind of half a minute. But it's somehow, it just is so ingrained, and we just don't want to kind of to step away from it. Yeah.
Jason, if we take that critique, which I do,
Can I jump in?
how does that help us with the pandemic? I mean, I've been interested watching the press kind of struggle with whether or not that COVID-19 is a natural disaster or not. How does that kind of analysis help us make better sense of what we're living through right now?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a little lag on my side. Sorry, my connection's not great.
No problem.
So, yeah, I think building on what Ksenia said, I think that that construct of that expression.
Oh.
Do you want me to pick up mid-sentence?
Yeah, we seem to have lost Jason, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
But
but yeah,
Ksenia, the same question to
luckily
you.
for
Just
us,
trying to,
yeah.
how we once we have that insight that the use of natural, without either thinking about it or sort of, as you said, sort of taking the humans out of the story, which then obscures politics and obscures power. What does that mean when we talk about COVID-19, do you think?
I think COVID actually helped us to kind of to expose that there is nothing natural about disaster, because whilst the media was saying how COVID is a great equalizer, right, and we're all sort of affected similarly, well, I think very fast we realized that actually that is not the case, and it's the most marginalized and the most systemically oppressed that were dying the fastest and also first, right? So it's BME population, right? So the Black and the minority ethnic. So it's in the US, I guess, it's the Black people and the people of color, right? It's different word than we're using. It's the elderly people, particularly those who were on their own. It's the key workers were exposed, whose salaries are the lowest, right? And who kind of have to work really long hours, and then they were affected. And I think that's very fast exposed how system relies actually on people who are not respected, and therefore nature has nothing to do with this, right? It's us as society who doesn't treat everyone equally, who doesn't respect everybody equally, and that actually as a society we're extremely greedy, and there are so many people profiteering on death, on the virus, and on the kind of everything that comes with this. And so hopefully if COVID doesn't convince people that disaster is not natural, then I don't know what would.
It's a good example, I think, Jason. I'm glad to see you back here. That the importance, when we get more specific with the language, really kind of what's at stake in a broader sense around science communication. And I guess that's my question for you. I mean, what can go wrong? Maybe what can go right, but what can go wrong when we're imprecise when we talk about science or when we talk about disaster?
That's a great question. So, like, on thinking about how the expression natural disaster is used to avoid responsibility, I think that COVID is a great time for us to explore this further, the impact of language, because I was in the hazards workshop, and somebody used the expression vulnerability to natural disaster. And I thought that's just we could unpack that for hours, because it kind of misunderstands what vulnerability is, it misunderstands what disaster is. But it's a commonly used kind of collection of words, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if you think we need to talk about what vulnerability is vulnerability naturally occurring? Like, is vulnerability created by decisions that we make? Why are disaster impacts discriminatory? All of these things are questions that are easier to or people are more willing to listen to these kind of discussions in the midst of a pandemic, where they're like, this is so unfair, the way this is playing out, right? So I think it's a perfect time for those discussions to be had. And in terms of, and I think that's like at the core of why we do science communication about disasters, as kind of, it's pretty central to what Ksenia and I both do. And really, like, usually we're talking about disasters that we maybe have a idea of what a disaster is as a long-term process of accumulated risk and encountering a hazard, which is sometimes very quick or rapidly occurring. And so for some people, that's kind of hard to grasp, like, oh, how was the risk created over time? And it's kind of, it takes a while to talk about. But then you have this, like, this environment now where there's a disaster unfolding over a long period of time, and everybody can see those those systemic risks just mounting and mounting in our societies due to injustice and inequality. And so science communication just becomes so important. And I think a lot of writers are doing a great job right now, and they may not be disaster writers or journalists, but they're writing about the stuff that we talk about all the time as disaster scholars, about how risk is created. So I'm really encouraged by the way that people are writing about risk, which is created in society and by society, by the decisions that we make, and relating it to COVID.
I've been impressed too, and I have to say that maybe in the last few years, seeing journalists in the United States become less hesitant in, like, for example, connecting weather events to climate events, just getting a little bit more confident in describing and talking about, like, say, disaster victims as such, but also as victims of structural racism, for example. I've noticed that as a shift in journalism. Ksenia, let me ask you, I mean, in a sense, then what you're really talking about is that any discussion of disaster, if I have you right, is also a discussion of power.
Absolutely.
And it's a discussion of inequality. That's a lot to take on, right? I think a lot of people who are kind of historically been drawn to disaster stories, they like them because they're very cinematic and there's good guys and bad guys and that sort of thing. Why are you trying to ruin that good time of no, but seriously, is that what's at stake here? Is that we should have been talking about power all along? Instead, we were getting lost in kind of high-flown talk about natural disaster?
Yes, I don't think we've ever been lost. It's just that narrative, that discourse has been hidden because it's uncomfortable, because it really kind of requires bringing lots of disciplines together, right? So I'll kind of unpack this a little bit. So first of all, for me, the reason we start talking about disasters as events, right, that kind of occurring over the historic events. So every disaster has started in the past, right? And the future disaster has already started now. We know that, we understand that. And I think now we're talking about it a little bit more because we are starting to work better together between disciplines. We still have a massive issue with the way we are trained in silos, right? So if I'm a social scientist, then I go and do my social science research methods. If you're an engineer, then you go and do your kind of experiments, right? And the natural scientists do quantitative work. And we still don't know how to talk to each other. But I think gradually we're learning, right? Maybe we are sort of forced to do that a little bit more. And maybe people are a bit braver in exploring each other's boundaries. And that helps. So all of a sudden you kind of start questioning, well, what you're saying makes sense, right? And I think the fact that maybe all the political upheaval that we've seen in the last kind of few years, really helped us to express our thoughts in terms of power and then translate them onto disaster. To me, Haiti earthquake is probably the best demonstration of kind of how disaster is about power, because it showed that the government that has been kind of rotten with corruption, and that didn't happen because the people were bad. That were the kind of the results of colonialism, right? And the later on, even after the independence, the rulers were still not the people of Haiti. And so that showed how power really unfolds. And we can still, unfortunately, see 10 years on that the power, it's the powerful who win, and it's the powerful who made the money. And people without power just don't even have a little bit of resources to get together, right? Because to be stronger, you need to have a little bit of kind of push. And then secondly to that, I think we have been hiding power really, really well because of the language we use in disasters. And again, they're much more critical thought now in that sense. And that, in the kind of 80s, when this 70s, 80s, and then 90s, when the idea of neoliberalism really took off, right? We all know about the projects of the World Bank and the IMF, how they went to African countries to make African countries developed, right? Because that development has been the key, and the development is all about economic growth. And with that came this idea of resilience. And, I find it fascinating how such a simple word as resilience, right, that has been used kind of in natural science and psychiatry and kind of medical science for years, we then took it and just absolutely used it and abused it. And so from sort of neoliberal point of view, the countries had to become resilient because that was the key for the economic development. And resilience means good, right? If you're resilient, you're good. And therefore, if you're not resilient, you're bad. And nobody wants to be bad, right? Because everything is binary. And so the system and the World Bank kind of keeps throwing the austerity measures and whatever else they can find, right, into marginalized population. And people catch this and yet remain productive because we want to be good. We want to be resilient. And this narrative it's wonderful. It hides power so well, right? And I think we really need to talk about this, and we need to unpack this.
Jason, okay, so now we've got natural disaster and resilience, powerful words in common circulation that hide, either intentionally or probably often unintentionally, they seem to hide deeper histories and power dynamics. What other terms and phrases should we be alert to, or how should we be talking about disaster if we're not going to use those, or if we have to use those more precisely or critically?
So I think this is difficult because people are competing for funding, people are communicating to different audiences and using language that they think is going to be understood, not necessarily the language which is the most precise from their expert opinion. So it's not a simple task. I think, thinking back to the natural disaster example, I would, instead of just saying disaster, if you want to speak to a certain audience that understands natural disaster in a certain way or expects that expression, you have an opportunity to deepen their knowledge of what that means, of what a disaster is. So you can say something like so-called natural disaster, right? And then you can explain why you said that, why you said so-called. Because that's the core message. That's the core of that lets you get to the root cause of disaster. If you say natural disaster without any critique of that language, you're missing an opportunity to actually talk about what's going on, right? And generally, you see that happening. And in the work that we've done, we saw that most authors are using it just simply as a buzzword. And so authors, even that fully understand the social construction of risk, are using it as a buzzword. because they know that it's expected. It's expected by reviewers. It's expected by the public, maybe. So I think that's a problem. But also, I mean, we could go through all of the words in our Anglophone conception of these ideas. And this is something we're working on at the moment. Maybe Ksenia would say more. We're about to submit a paper about language translation.
Yeah, so we've got this really exciting project. I mean, it's slightly random. So we were just curious, because we both work internationally mainly. And so every time there is a research project, there is always either resilience or vulnerability or everything, right? So you name it, we have to use those terms to get funding. And we started asking many of us ourselves, well, so when you work with the community, so we usually work with local researchers who then do research, right? And every single time there would be a problem with translating resilience or translating vulnerability or even translating the word disaster. And we kind of start thinking, right, if this doesn't translate well, what does that mean? And so we did a very simple exercise on Twitter. We just asked people saying, can you just, ask your colleagues and friends, how do the 6 words, so it was vulnerability, capacity, resilience, hazard, risk, and disaster, how does it translate into your native language, right, into your local language? And then if it doesn't translate really well, or, whatever word you use, can you actually describe that word back to us in English, not just translate, but describe back? And people absolutely got involved in that. And we now have 54 languages. And so across these languages, none of these words really translate, right? And so we are trying to research something in communities and in the countries where the words that we are researching are pretty much meaningless. And therefore, what we are really doing is reestablishing our own message of, again, power, right, and privilege, and that we are talking about things that we think we need to be addressing and that we think that are problematic in a language that we have chosen to address it in. And I don't mean English, I mean English, but also the language of power, right, that the language of expertise. And then many communities now do use those words because they know that academics and NGOs come and use them. But in real life, they're completely meaningless. So we worked with our friend Neil, who's a linguist, who kind of helped us to really frame it in theoretical terms. Because again, translation and linguistics and disasters don't really work together very well, apart from translation and emergencies, but not that kind of bigger, longer term. And yeah, hopefully we'll get a paper out of it soon. But it's been so much fun. It's great.
So it sounds like a lot more than a paper. It sounds like a whole subfield of what we work on. And I think there's so much in what you were just talking about. In part, it's the unsurprising act of forming an entire linguistic enterprise that we use to describe oppression and inequality, and then deploying it in the absence of a participatory process to find out how people would themselves describe that. And to me, it also really underscores this absolute necessity that we have interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and international teams. Because I could totally imagine a process like that, and no anthropologist on the team, all Americans on the team, and we're trying to understand what resilience means in sub-Saharan Africa, and nobody bothered to figure out what sorts of terminology, what sorts of metaphors, what sorts of temporalities were in circulation and use in that place. Not just so that you don't do additional harm and damage, but so that we can actually ourselves learn and do a better job in our own communities. I mean, that's what to me is so provocative about what you're describing. Yeah. It's a full praxis which takes into account the power of language.
Absolutely. And we don't consider that at all. We don't think about the power of language.
If I could.
Yeah. No, I'm wishing I talked with you about this 12 months ago. Somehow I could have weaseled my way into your paper. Okay, Jason, what you were going to respond to that, though?
I just wanted to quote from the paper that we just finished. I think it's a good opportunity to quote a part that I really love from the paper, because we were talking about the way that when you translate from from English into non-Anglophone languages, that because it's a dominant scientific language, it tends to kind of impose itself on the language, the non-Anglophone language. And when you translate back the other way, you do the opposite. You kind of defer to the dominant language, right? So anyway, in the conclusion, I love this phrase, because we said that we need to create space for non-Western perspectives to enter and enrich Anglophone discussions, facilitating genuine dialogue rather than a one-way quasi-imperialist imposition of ideas. I liked it. You like it, Ksenia?
I like it, but I also we just kind of cancelled 50 minutes of our conversation, how we were promoting clear language, and then we went for a quasi-imperialist conversation. But academic talk, what can I say?
You're listening to COVID Calls, and you can get your questions in on YouTube Live chat or on Twitter. You're getting some interesting comments up on Twitter right now. People are listening and finding some real value in the way that we're talking about language. And of course, people are excited in your work. And to me, that's a good segue to talk not only about your research, but to talk about what you've undertaken as science and disaster communicators. So, let's talk about Disaster Deconstructed. Either one of you want to, maybe first of all, before we get the origin story, but just kind of find out, like, what do you aim to do with the podcast? What is its sort of main goal? Either one of you want to take that?
I go.
Okay.
It was your idea.
I can. Yeah, I can go.
Okay.
Well, it was kind of a process that got us there. I mean, to some degree, starting to write in more journalistic style for The Conversation, for magazines, starting to do more public outreach and engagement and talks to people who were non-academics was part of the process. And so then in 2018, we had a discussion about a podcast that would be different than anything that was out there, in that it would try to get at the root causes of disaster and try to make some of the really complex concepts that we deal with accessible to people who are non-experts. And so right from the start, it has been a podcast that is created with the public in mind. And we've been very fortunate to have a lot of listeners who are experts, and a lot of listeners who are researchers or are practitioners. But we're looking for new ways to reach the public. And one of the ways that we have done that is by making or focusing our second season, which ran from January until April, I think, making that about stories of disaster. And we're continuing that into our third season, which is just launched at the start of July, which you're on, our first episode of our third season, Scott, which is a great episode if anyone wants to check it out. And so we're trying to reach the public with these messages that we've been talking about. Where is risk really coming from? Why are people disproportionately or discriminately affected by disaster? And they're kind of the things we keep coming back to almost every week. And certainly in season 3, we have a big focus on different ways of communicating. And in the coming weeks, we're talking to different journalists and musicians and artists. And so it's going to be really exciting in season 3 to open up that space to talk about different ways of communicating.
Ksenia, just to get your perspective on what it's been like to work in the podcast, who did you check with first? How did you get permission to do this sort of thing? Where do you apply to? I mean, I found this myself when we started doing this. I'm like, shouldn't there be some oversight? What? But but no, it's a bit of a moment of opportunity there, and you've led the way. How did you begin to shape it?
Yeah, this is kind of free for all, right? Anyone who wants to do a podcast can do a podcast. I think, well, as Jason said, we were kind of keen, on communicating the ideas differently, not just in an academic way for a while. But I think maybe in 2017, when we were in global platform for disaster risk reduction in Cancun, that's we really started thinking about the way that we talk about disasters. And there was a bit of a corridor activism and kind of all sorts of things happening with No Natural Disasters campaign. That's when it really picked up. And we also realized that actually there is so much we can say, right? And we don't really have a platform to say that. Twitter doesn't quite cut it. And I mean, podcast was Jason's idea completely. The way I got involved, he called me at like 6 a.m. saying, do you want to do a podcast? And I was like, yeah, sure. What else is there to do? And there I was. But to us, it's a collaborative project. So we really work together well. And I think we do work together well, not just on podcasts, because we're friends, right? It comes naturally, but we discuss everything, not in that, okay, today we're going to discuss this, right? It doesn't work like this. There's never an agenda. It's a very kind of fluid, very natural process where we sort of know what we want to achieve, right? So we know that, for example, for season 2 and 3 and maybe 4, we want to talk about stories and narratives because there is so much to cover there. But how we would do that and whom we would talk to, we don't necessarily know. Sometimes it's just the conversation. Sometimes we meet people, sometimes we kind of see somebody who knows somebody who is really, really exciting. And sometimes just events that kind of make us think that, okay, maybe we should cover this perspective or that perspective. So it's a very natural process for us. And our discussion, as you know, Scott, is not particularly structured. So we usually send guests some idea of what it is we want to talk about, but we don't script. We used to. Our first episode is so scripted now. It's kind of quite painful to listen to it. But I think we learned how to talk. I haven't learned how not to interrupt each other yet. Maybe it's like in next 50 seasons we'll learn. Really bad at it. But yeah, so it's all really about kind of being able to chat and being able to think, but also I think it's about being able to listen. I mean, I have learned so much in the last 3 seasons that I don't think I would have ever learned so much by just kind of reading academic papers. It's amazing. My brain has just kind of expanded and I have so many more questions. And I think this is making me a better academic. That's making me a better researcher. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. It's a personal development project, I think, first and foremost.
Thank you for sharing that perspective on it. I think it's something that, for myself, writing, when you come up in an academic tradition, like in the humanities and social sciences, often the expectation is you have to go out and learn everything on your topic, and then you sit to write. And that writing is just a download, which I think unfortunately also leads to the lack of style in a lot of academic writing. Whereas if you treat writing as a form of thinking and as a form of exploration, then it becomes joyful, painful, joyful. And you're describing the podcast in the same way. And I wonder, Jason, is that also something that you both sort of connect on this issue about using the podcast as a mode of research? Because I think for a lot of people, that will be surprising, that the expectation is, no, you have to have mastered this issue before you could possibly interview someone about it. But that's not what Ksenia is saying.
No, I totally agree with both of you. And the process is so central to growth and learning. And I think that's kind of reflected probably in the way that both of us approach education as well, in that we don't need to be the expert on everything. We don't need to be the fount of knowledge, but you invite your students into a learning space, a learning collective, and you be vulnerable, and you say, and if someone challenges you on something, you say, oh, I don't actually know that. but this is a way you might find out the answer, and tell me about your experience on that. And you don't have to be the expert all the time. And I think, like Ksenia said, the learning process that we've had the opportunity to go through by talking with all these incredible people over 3 seasons. We've recorded our whole 3rd season now. So over 3 seasons, it's phenomenal, because just thinking about what you can learn from reading a paper, you don't have the opportunity usually to ask follow-up questions about something you read in the paper, but you have somebody on the line in an interview, and they say something, and you're like, whoa, that's so exciting. And then you can ask a follow-up question to go even deeper.
Right.
And that's just an incredible opportunity. And I don't think it's something we planned it or even understood that would happen. But it's something really exciting about what we do.
That's a great insight, that also in a world where seemingly we can be connected however and whenever we want to, there's still so many limits on our ability to connect and on the time that we make for connection. And I think that's, again, one of the things I really like about what you're doing is you're giving that time for the longer explanation and for those that back and forth. We've got a comment here from Local to Global Disaster Support. Little kudos to you both. You guys are the real deal. It makes us better to listen to you. It's always nice to get a comment like that. Tremendous. Yeah, it's great. So, we had the opportunity on Sunday the 3 of us co-facilitate for the Hazards Workshop. It was a great honor to do that. And we talked about the challenge of researchers interacting with professional communicators, journalists in different forms. There was a theme that came up that I've been thinking about ever since then, and it had to do with how to extend the platform. So part of what we're talking about here are the challenges that academics like us might face, some of them logistical or material, some of them just psychological, like can I take the leap to write a blog post or to write an op-ed or maybe to do a podcast. But then there's that challenge of how do we go to the next stage, which was suggested in our conversation, that maybe the next stage is really extending the platform to non-academics and people who don't have the ability to share their knowledge and share their insights. And that the podcast, these kind of social media platforms, are really a way to do that. I just wanted we're almost up on time actually, but I wanted to brainstorm with you both a little bit about that. If you had any thoughts since Sunday, it's hardly any time, but is that something that's been on your mind about the possibilities of this medium to really potentially change the way we do disaster research in a more fundamental way, a more inclusive way? Jason, can I ask you that first?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that comes to mind is we've thought for a while about having reports from the field, and bringing stories from those who are researched. We would hope in moving forward in disaster research that those who are researched become the researchers, right? And that certainly encourage more citizen science and community controlled and centered research. And so I really feel like the podcast is an opportunity for us to bring stories directly from people who have the knowledge of that place and of that experience. And so I'm really excited about work that we're doing up in Port St. Joe in the Panhandle, which is a photo voice research. And I'm really looking forward to bringing some of the data from those interviews and making space on the podcast for those stories from local people to go out, because I think that's that can be much more powerful than any story I tell.
Yeah, totally. But also, I guess I think it would be fantastic to have non-academic, non-practitioners, right? So not us on the podcast, and we're really trying to do that, because I think even if we choose one issue, say COVID, right, and we invite different groups of people to talk about it, imagine the perspective we would get, right? Imagine if we talk to children about COVID. Imagine if we talk to, I don't know, key workers, right? Imagine if we talk to people who are homeschooling and working at the same time, and maybe those who spend quarantine in a kind of 5-star hotel or on the yacht. I don't know, whatever, right? But just unpacking the same topic from different perspectives would have given us as academics the lens that we would never get otherwise. I would love to do that, but I guess getting to that step, it takes guts. It's difficult. It's just like doing research, right? We don't want to go into the community and just interview people and that is it, right? Because that's extractive, and this is the last thing we should do as researchers. We should never do that. So I think we just need to kind of think how does that then benefit community? Whose voices are we amplifying, and what is the reason for that, and what is the benefit to those people? And I think if we can find the answer to that, it'll be so much so exciting and just so cool to do.
So I just want to get a last question in for each of you. And Ksenia, let me ask you first. This is a quite extraordinary disaster that we're living through in so many different ways. Simultaneity of the global experience and the pace of it, and so many other aspects of it that have been remarked upon. So as a researcher, what are you finding yourself most attentive to in COVID-19? What are the new things that you're learning, things that have been surprising to you? How is it changing you as a researcher?
I think as a researcher, it really allowed me to maybe reflect more on what is important in the society. You know, it just kind of reconfirmed some of the worries maybe and concerns that I had. But also gave me hope in that more people have become aware of what it is we're doing and why we're doing that. And I think what has also become really important for me in that, hopefully as a research community, we have realized now that we cannot work in silos. We cannot work on our own. You know, even if we're from the same discipline, we should work together. It's better to be a team, right? We can achieve so much more. We can benefit so many more people. But at the same time, we cannot rely on a system that is underfunded, that promotes certain messages. So we need to again, if we are together, we can resist that system, and we can become better, right? We can become better researchers. We can become better human beings. And yeah, so that is kind of my reflection from COVID.
Jason, what have you been learning either as a disaster researcher or learning about yourself as a researcher through this COVID time?
Well, some people may find this surprising, but I feel like I'm becoming more radicalized to go deeper in the analysis of injustice and inequality in society as the really being at the core of the risk that we experience unequally. And so, but to echo what Ksenia said, I think it also makes me a lot more hopeful, because the situation people have been put in, especially in this country, has created, you know, these kind of cascading impacts, and people are on the streets demanding change, and showing the best in society, and that people care for each other, that people care for those who are most impacted by this, and who are most impacted by the everyday disaster that they live through, which might be poverty, it might be racism. You know, those are things that people are living through every day. So I just feel hopeful because so many people are saying we've had enough.
Tomorrow, my guest on COVID Calls will be Fallon Samuels-Adu, and we're going to be talking about economic recovery. She's a tremendous scholar based in the University of New Orleans. Please do join me for that. And I really want to thank my guests on COVID Calls today, Ksenia Chimotina and Jason von Meding. the co-hosts and creators of Disasters Deconstructed, and you can check that out. I believe all of the episodes are available on Podbean, am I right? And
That's right.
probably anywhere else you can get podcasts, I would imagine.
That's right.
Check out those seasons. They're in their third season. Ksenia and Jason, thanks a million for your time today. As usual, just great to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay, stay
Thanks,
healthy,
everybody, for
everybody.
watching.
We'll
See you
see you
later.
at 5 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.